We're finishing up a series of teaching called Love Like Jesus. And we've been looking at some different times in which Jesus showed love and in different ways to individuals that he came in contact with. And today's focus is on physical touch. And here's something I want to find out. When I say physical touch, what is it that comes to your mind? I can tell you what half of the people in this room are thinking, because when this topic was posted in our newsletter on Friday afternoon, I got a few text messages and emails from women saying, "Oh, you're going to be talking about sexual intimacy this Sunday, are you?" And they were hoping that I would have some effect upon their husbands. But that's not the case. Right? We're not talking about that. We have too many kids around anyway. And but I'm going to talk about physical touch, but it's not sexual intimacy that we're talking about. That is a language that should be spoken in the marriage relationship. But what I've come to understand is that our cultural tendency is to sexualize the word touch. So we're going to look at how we can show love through physical touch in any context, in different relationships. Now, a lot of research has been done on the power of touch, and doctors have written about an actual condition called skin hunger. And much like starvation, if you haven't experienced it, then you don't really know how bad this is. But it's this deep craving for someone to touch you in a loving, appropriate, and affectionate way. And doctors tell us that humans, children and adults, can't live without it. And if you suffer from skin hunger, then you will also experience depression, moodiness, anxiety, irritability, pain, and discomfort. And the right kind of touch shows us that we are cared for, that we are loved, that we are valued. And I know some of you have probably been on the receiving end of the wrong kind of touch. Maybe it was an angry kind of touch. Maybe it was an abusive touch. And it has actually led you to try to avoid any kind of touch altogether. But a loving touch can be life-giving. And science tells us that it's closely associated with improved IQ, language acquisition in young children, reading achievement and memory, improved geriatric health. So there's great power in touch. And Jesus understood that, because as the great physician, he was going around teaching, but he wasn't just teaching, he was healing people. And when he healed them, he would touch them. When he healed the blind men, the Bible says that he touched their eyes. When he healed Peter's mother-in-law, he touched her. So Jesus doesn't just heal the guy in today's biblical account, he touches him. So let's read this together in Luke 5, beginning with verse 12. In one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. Now, Luke is actually the only one of the gospel writers that mentions that this was an advanced case of leprosy. And it's not surprising, because he was actually a medical doctor. And when the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. "Lord," he said, "if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean." And here it is. And Jesus reached out and touched him. And the Greek word for touched here is the word that literally means fasten onto. So I want you to get the picture of what's taking place in the story. This isn't a televangelist with a $3,000 suit on and standing beside this golden piano and pushing people on the forehead. Fasten onto. Maybe Jesus put his arm around the guy. Maybe he put his hands on both shoulders and just stared right into his eyes. But he touched him, and he fastened onto him. "I am willing," he said, "be healed." And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus instructed him not to tell anyone what had happened. And he said, "Go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed." So the miracle showed Jesus' power, but the touch actually showed Jesus' love. And there's not a lot that we know about this man. This is kind of a straightforward story. Matthew and Mark tell the same account, but they don't give us any new information. So we're left to wonder, what was his life like? And it's hard for us in 2024 to truly appreciate the difference the touch of Jesus made in this leper's life. Years ago, I read a story written by Max Lucado where he imagines what it must have been like for this man to live with that disease at that time, and what a difference the touch of Jesus must have made. So you can just close your eyes, or we're going to be dark.
During harvest, my grip on the scythe seemed to weaken. The tips of my fingers turned numb. First one finger, and then another. And before long I could grip the tool, but I could scarcely feel it. By the end of the season, I felt nothing at all. The hand holding the handle may as well have belonged to someone else. All feeling was gone. I didn't tell my wife, but she must have suspected something. How could she not? I held my hand against my body like a wounded bird. One afternoon, I plunged my hands into a basin of water, intending to wash my face, and the water turned red. My finger was bleeding and bleeding freely. I didn't even know I'd been wounded. Had I cut myself with a knife? Had I run my hand along a sharp edge of metal? I must have, but I hadn't felt anything. "It's on your clothes too," my wife said softly. She was behind me, and before I turned to look at her, I looked down at the crimson splotches all over my robe. I just stood there for the longest time at the basin, staring at my hand and realizing that somehow my life had changed forever. "Shall I go with you to the priest?" she asked. "No, I'll go alone." I turned and looked into her tear-filled eyes, and there, standing next to her, was my daughter. I knelt down and I looked into her little face and I caressed her cheek with my good hand. What could I say? I stood and looked at my wife again, and she reached out and touched my shoulder, and I touched hers. It would be our final touch.
That people would lose sensation in the extremities. And Paul Brand was a doctor who was considered a leading researcher in the field of leprosy. And he told about a time when he was in India in a leper colony, and he saw some men lying in the ditch, and they were sleeping there, and a rat was actually chewing on the end of their fingers, and they didn't wake up because they had no sensation. They felt nothing. And while you had no feeling in your extremities, there was great pain in the joints. So you felt no pain where you should feel pain, and no pain where you should be feeling it. And spotting a leper was easy enough because their face would have been discolored, there would have been sores on their face, and besides all of that, there was this putrid smell that went along with the disease. So it was contagious, and people were quarantined from the rest of society as soon as you were found to have leprosy. And it wasn't just the physical quarantine, but it was spiritual as well, because this was considered to be a curse from God. So you were unclean, and people stayed away from you. And in those days, if you touched something unclean, that made you unclean as well. So anywhere a leper went, if he saw others in the distance, he would have to shout out a warning, and then people would stay as far away as possible from him. Just remember in the early days of COVID when we were out walking on the sidewalk, if we met someone else, one of us would go right out onto the street. We were giving all kinds of distance, and that's what it would have been like for this man. So he received a life sentence of never being touched, no more back rubs, handshakes, hugs. kisses on the cheek, no more tears wiped away from his eyes. And according to the Levitical law, when someone was found to have leprosy, they would go before the high priest who would declare them officially unclean.
The priest didn't touch me. He looked at my hands, now wrapped in a rag. I have never faulted him for what he said. I know he was just doing as he had been instructed. He covered his mouth and extended his hands toward me. Palm forward, "You are unclean." And with that one pronouncement, I lost my family. I lost my farm, my friends, my future. Oh, how I repulsed people. As I stepped out, they stepped back. 5 years of leprosy left my hands gnarled. The tips of my fingers were missing as one of my ears and my nose. When I stepped out, at the sight of me, husbands would grab their children. Wives would cover their eyes and little children would point and stare. The rugs that I wore couldn't hide the smell of my rotting flesh or the sores that covered my entire body. I grew so tired of it all, so tired of living in the commune, smelling the stench, so tired of the bell that I was required to wear around my neck to warn others of my presence, as if that was necessary. One sight and the announcement began, "Unclean, unclean, unclean." And so for 5 years, no one touched me. Not my wife, not my child, not my friends. There was no touch, not one. What is common to you, I coveted. A handshake, a warm embrace, a tap on the shoulder just to get my attention, a kiss on the lips. Such moments were banned from my life. No one touched me. No one even bumped into me. Oh, how I longed to find myself caught in a crowd where my shoulder might brush against another's. But for 5 years, it did not happen. And how could it? I was not allowed on the streets. I was not permitted in the synagogues. I was unwelcome in my own home. I was untouchable.
Mother Teresa worked with lepers on the streets of Calcutta, and she said one time, "We have drugs to treat diseases like leprosy, but the drugs don't treat the real problem, the disease of being unwanted. That may be the worst kind of disease. That your child's at school, and nobody would sit beside him or her at lunch or at recess time. She wanders around in circles just waiting for someone to say, 'Hey, come and join us playing hopscotch,' or whatever game they might be playing. And you talk to her at night and you ask her, 'How did that make you feel?' And she said, 'It made me feel sick to my tummy.' Now, I don't know if that changes as adults. When a friend doesn't invite you out with the rest of the girls, or your dad doesn't take the time to call you on your birthday, or maybe your spouse works later and later, and then they start falling asleep on the sofa downstairs, and maybe it's another Friday night alone, and you're wondering, is anyone going to invite me? Is anyone going to choose me? Is anyone going to touch me? So even as adults, we know that feeling. So this leper, he must have felt that, yet when Jesus reaches out and grabs hold of him, that communicates something. That communicates, you have value. I accept you. You are wanted. And he didn't do it after the miracle, but before, as if to say, I love you the way you are. So he reaches out to love someone that is hard to love. Now, we do a pretty good job of loving the people that are easy to love. We easily speak the love languages to those who love back and speak those back to us. But do we do it really well to the people that aren't lovable? The people in our lives that just kind of drain us, or we don't feel that we're getting anything back in return from. Dr. Chapman calls this love's greatest challenge. loving people who are unlovable. And Jesus talks about this over in the next chapter, in Luke 6. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. If you love only those who love you, why should you get credit for that? Even sinners love those who love them. So do you see what he's saying? The real test is how well you speak these languages to the leper in your life. How well do you show love to those people that aren't lovable? Maybe it's a critical spouse or a critical parent, and they're always
Several
giving
weeks ago,
unwanted
I
advice,
dared to walk the
always
road to my
nagging or
village.
complaining,
I
pointing
didn't
out
enter,
mistakes,
heaven
second-guessing
forbid.
your decisions.
I just wanted
Or
to
maybe
look
it's
at
the
my
martyr in
fields,
your life. And when you talk to them, there's always something wrong in their life, or they're never appreciated. I work my fingers to the bone around here, and nobody seems to notice. Nobody says even thank you to me. So there's always something upsetting going on in their life. They're like a sponge and soak up your emotional energy. Or maybe you have someone in your life who is the center of attention, and they just love to hear themselves talk. They love to tell stories, and their stories are always going to be better than yours. Their kids are going to be the hero in their stories. They'll be the hero in their stories. My brother does this a little bit on stories about me. They're just not quite true, and he makes himself look a little better. Or maybe there's someone in your life who is the center of attention, and everything they do is just to draw that attention to themselves. Or what about the control freak? Do you have somebody like that in your life? They want to be in control of the remote control, or they go into convulsions. They want to choose the restaurant that you're going to eat at. And if you don't go to the one they said, you're going to hear about what they would be eating back at that other restaurant. You're sitting next to this person on the plane. They've never flown a plane, but they can land that plane better than the pilot just did. That's hard to love. And that's the test of loving like Jesus. How do you speak love to a critical husband, or a negative wife, or a high-maintenance neighbor, a backstabbing coworker, a neglectful father, a nosy mother-in-law, a jealous sister, an uninvolved brother, an inconsistent friend, a demanding boss? Who is the leper in your life that is easy to avoid, to stay away from, to keep your distance? Jesus was constantly finding himself in the presence of people who were marginalized by society. He invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house in order to be able to speak love into his life. He had the disciples try to shoo the children away from him, and he said, "No, let them come to me." And then there was the woman that had been caught in adultery that was brought before him, and he comes to her defense. So he loved the overlooked, touched the untouchable, and showed what it means to love.
Weeks ago, I dared to walk the road to my village. I didn't enter, heaven forbid. I just wanted to look at my fields, to gaze once more upon my house, and perhaps catch a glimpse, from a distance, of my wife's face. I didn't see her, but I saw some children playing in a pasture. I hid behind a tree and I watched them. Their faces were so joyful and their laughter so contagious that for just a moment, I was no longer a leper. I was a farmer, and I was a father, and I was a man. Infused with their happiness, I stood up from behind the tree. I straightened my back and I breathed deeply. And they saw me. Before I could retreat, they saw me. They screamed and they scattered. But one child lingered behind the rest. One paused and turned towards me. I can't be sure, but I think it was my daughter. I think she was looking for her father. It's that one look that led me to take the step I took. I know it was reckless. I know it was risky. But what did I have to lose? I hid behind some rocks and watched as Jesus descended a hill. Throngs of people were following him. I waited until he was just a few feet away from me, and I stepped out. Master, Master! And he stopped and turned towards me, as did dozens of others. Fear flooded through the crowd. People put their hands up in front of their faces. Again, I don't blame them. I was a huddled mass of death, but I scarcely heard them. I scarcely saw them. The panic I had seen 1,000 times. His compassion, however, I had never seen before. Everyone stepped back but him. He stepped towards me. I didn't move. I said, Lord, you can heal me if you will. And had he healed me with a word, I would have been thrilled. Had he healed me with a prayer, I would have rejoiced. But he was not satisfied with simply speaking to me. He came toward me. He touched me. I will. He said so close he had to whisper, be healed. And energy flooded my body. In a moment, in an instant, there was warmth where there had been numbness. There was strength where there had been atrophy. My back straightened. My head lifted. A moment ago, I was eye level with his belt, and now I was eye level with his smiling face. He reached out and cupped my cheek in his hands and drew me so close I could feel the warmth of his breath and see the tears in his eyes. Go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifice that Moses commanded for those who have been made well. I will never forget the one who dared to touch me.
It's
He could
incredible
have
for us
healed me
to
with a word.
try and put ourselves in that person's place, what it was like, but the experience of Jesus touching him. And the miracle showed Jesus' power, but the touch revealed his love. And this week you are going to have some opportunities to show the love of Jesus in a loving, appropriate, affectionate touch. And physical touch can communicate things that words can't. You'll have an opportunity this week to say, I'm there for you, by putting your arm around somebody. An opportunity to say, I'm so glad you're here, by giving them a handshake. An opportunity to say, I care about you, with a nice hug. An opportunity to say, way to go, with a pat on the back. There are things that a touch can communicate much more effectively than words. It's also a touch that says, I celebrate with you. If you happen to watch team sports and you'll notice when a team scores a goal, the rest of the guys don't just go, way to go. But they're excited for the person that has scored the goal. They swarm in. They all embrace. And then maybe the guy that scored the goal, he then goes and high fives all the rest of the people that are sitting on the bench. But we express excitement through touch. So here's the question. Who is it in your life that would feel loved if they received an affectionate touch from you? Maybe it is your spouse. Marriage counselors tell us that one of the accurate gauges of intimacy within a marriage relationship is physical touch. So you'll watch a couple. Are they holding hands? Do they give a goodbye kiss or hug? Maybe it's a welcome home kiss. But don't underestimate the connection that takes place when you speak the language of love in your marriage. Maybe it's your child. Studies have shown over and over again that from the time they're born, they need to be shown love and physical touch. So we've got newborns here, like Elias, and he's held all the time. He's kissed all the time. He's feeling that love. But then they grow, and that love is expressed in different ways. Maybe with your son, it's wrestling on the floor. With your daughter, it might be tickling her. My oldest daughter, Brittany, who's on the bass guitar here this morning, I used to tickle her and she screams, stop, 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 stop. So I stop, and then she just lie there, more. And I tickle her some more, and then stop, 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 stop. And then the same thing. It would just go on and on. I do the same thing with my granddaughter, Jane. And that never stops, that connection, but it takes on a different form. In the first service here this morning, my wife, Pat, was sitting in that second row massaging the hand of one of our adult daughters. So just understand that whether your child is 5, 15, 25, 45, you need to show love through appropriate, affectionate touch. Maybe for you, it's an elderly parent or grandparent. And studies show that some of the most touch-hungry people are seniors, especially if they have lost their spouse. After my grandfather Nicholson died, my grandmother started holding my hand, which she had never done before. And then she would give my brother and I the greatest back rubs just to stay connected with us. And she had really rough hands from being on the farm. So it was a back rub and a scratch all in one. It was an amazing combination. But you may have an opportunity with an older parent or a grandparent to give a handshake or a pat on the back. But actually, don't do that. Give a hug and hold on until it feels like you should let go. Maybe it's even a neighbor, a co-worker, a handicapped friend of yours. And here's what the Bible says in Proverbs 3. Never walk away from someone who deserves help. Your hand is God's hand for that person. I love that as a way to think of our hands. My hand is God's hand in the life of that individual. In John 13:34, Jesus said, "So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other." So Jesus has loved us by speaking these languages into our lives. And now we're called to show love to other people by speaking those very same languages. And we're not unlike the leper. We have a disease, and that disease is called sin. And that disease has separated us from God and made us untouchable from Him. Yet He reached out when we were most untouchable. In Romans 5:8. But God showed His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. Now there's a painting that was done by Michelangelo that forms part of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and you've probably seen it. I couldn't show it in church because there's nudity in it, and the teens would get all worked up over it. But in that painting, it's God and Adam. And God is reaching down toward Adam. He is looking at Adam. He has turned his body toward him. He has his hand outstretched and his finger outstretched. So he's straining, and you can just see the muscles bulging as he is trying to reach down to Adam. And he's just so close. But that's as far as God can come. He has to allow us to come the rest of the way. There's that smallest amount of space there. But having come so close, He allows us this much space so that we can choose. So He waits to see what Adam will do. And in that painting, it's harder to interpret what's going on with the character of Adam because he's reclined on a sofa. And it looks like he doesn't really care at all. And he has his arm out, but he's not straining. His arm's out, his finger is out, and he's just so close to touching God. Maybe he's thinking that God will close that gap. After all, God has come this far, so maybe God will go further. But God has come as far as He can come. So when we were clean and untouchable, God reached out to us, and He has extended the finger to us through Jesus Christ. And the question is, will you receive His touch? He has reached out. He has stretched as far as He can. And there is that smallest gap between Him and you. So what are you going to do? Jesus has reached out to you, If you are ready to reach out to him and you want to talk to someone about that, speak to me. Speak to James, our other pastor. Speak to one of our other elders. There are many others here in the church that are in leader roles as well that will speak to you. But don't go from here without finding how you can fill that tiny gap between you and God.